It happened on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled like rain and warm asphalt. I was dragging my poodle down the sidewalk, embarrassed and mildly sweating, my shoes clicking unevenly against the concrete. He yanked and barked at anything that moved, cars, joggers, the ghost of a squirrel, and I was just trying to keep my dignity intact. That's when I saw her. Across the street, in the middle of a commotion, stood a woman in all black, holding the leash of a German shepherd who looked seconds away from mauling a passing cyclist. But then she tilted her head, said something I couldn't hear, and the dog sat. Just like that. No yelling, no jerking, no treats. Just silence and obedience. I don't know what made me cross the street. It was like gravity, the kind you feel when you've been seen. Not just noticed, seen. She stood like she belonged to another kind of world, one where everything bent to her rhythm. Her hair was tight back tight, her posture relaxed but commanding. I remember the gloves first, black leather, creased with use, like she never took them off. She didn't look at me right away, just gave the shepherd a small pat on the chest and unclipped the leash. He stayed sitting. She finally turned toward me with a nod, and I knew I would be hiring her, but I didn't know why yet. I called the number on her card that night. It was embossed, heavy, the kind that made you think twice before throwing it out. Behavioral Reinforcement Specialist, it said in sharp serif type. That sounded more like something you'd see on a resume for a prison warden, not a dog trainer. But something in me didn't question it. I wanted structure. I wanted results. More than that, I wanted to know how she did it, how she made the world quiet without raising her voice. When she came to my house, I cleaned like I was preparing for a date. I wore a blouse I hadn't touched in years, one that made my arms look toned and my waist a little slimmer. I tried to act casual, leaning in the doorway, pretending I wasn't dying of curiosity. She arrived exactly on time, not early, not late. Punctuality as a weapon. She wore the same gloves, same all-black outfit, this time with a harness slung over one shoulder and a bag full of tools I couldn't identify. She didn't smile when I opened the door, just looked me in the eye, then at my dog, and then back at me, and nodded again. That nod, like she was already in charge. The session started in the living room, but she moved like she already knew the layout. My dog barked once. She didn't flinch. She lowered herself to his level, not with affection, but calculation. She studied him. No words, no calls for good boy, just quiet observation, the kind that makes you aware of your breathing. I sat on the edge of the couch, unsure if I was supposed to do something. She finally looked over and asked me to stand. Her voice was calm. Not sweet, not cold, just centered, like a river that never changes course. She adjusted my grip on the leash, moved my hand an inch lower, told me to breathe differently. "You're too loose," she said. "You're not connected to him. He doesn't trust you because you're not sure of yourself." I nodded, too quickly, eager. And then she stepped behind me. She put her hands on my shoulders, firm, flat palms guiding me into alignment. My spine straightened. My heartbeat tripled. She moved my arms, positioned my feet, stood so close I could smell her skin. Not perfume, not sweat, just warmth and leather and control. I wanted to hold that moment like breath underwater. I couldn't focus on the dog, not really. She was speaking, giving commands, analyzing behavior, but all I could think about was the pressure of her body behind mine, the quiet authority. I didn't feel judged. I felt observed, not just by her eyes, but by her entire presence. It was the first time in a long time that I felt small in the best way, like someone else was finally holding the reins I didn't know I needed to hand over. The session lasted an hour, maybe less. Time folded in on itself. When she left, I stood by the door too long, the leash still in my hand, my dog quiet for the first time in weeks. The air felt different, thicker, more honest. I didn't move for several minutes after she was gone, just stared at the spot where she had stood. Her absence felt heavier than most people's presence. That night, I lay in bed replaying everything. Her voice, her hands, the way she looked at me like she already knew what I'd been hiding from myself. I told myself I'd hired her to fix my dog, but somewhere deeper, in a place I hadn't dusted off in years, I felt the shift. I wasn't looking for obedience in him. I was craving discipline in me. And somehow she saw that before I did. By the third session, I had started preparing for her the way I used to prepare for interviews or funerals, meticulous, reverent, a little afraid. I would sweep the floors twice even if they were already clean. I'd check my reflection in every mirror before she arrived, smoothing my hair, adjusting my shirt, second-guessing the neckline. I told myself it was about professionalism, about respect, but there was something else pressing against the back of my teeth, something I wouldn't let myself name. Every time the doorbell rang, my pulse jumped like I'd done something wrong. She never lingered on pleasantries. She walked in with the confidence of someone who had been invited long before she ever knocked. The dog followed her instructions better with each visit, but I noticed she was spending less time correcting him and more time watching me. She'd reposition my hands, tell me to lower my shoulders, remind me to breathe from my diaphragm. I hung on every word, nodding too often, my eyes darting away when she held my gaze for too long. I didn't know what unnerved me more, her closeness or the way I started needing it. The air between us thickened during each lesson. I began to anticipate her presence, the rhythm of her movements, the silence she carried like armor. When she stood behind me to correct my posture, I would feel her breath against my ear, and I had to fight the impulse to close my eyes. There was never anything overt, no touches that lingered too long, no inappropriate comments. But her control didn't need to be spoken. It seeped in through her tone, her precision, the way she never hesitated and never repeated herself. I had never wanted to obey someone so badly. At night, I started dreaming about her. Not sexually at first, just her voice instructing me, guiding me. Sometimes I saw myself walking beside her on a leash, not like an animal, but like someone who had finally found order. I would wake up flushed, chest tight, legs tangled in the sheets, ashamed of how calm those dreams made me feel. I stopped talking about the sessions to anyone, not that anyone had asked, but it felt like a secret I wasn't ready to share, as if exposing it would shatter the fragile equilibrium we had built. I began choosing my clothes with her in mind. Nothing too flashy, nothing that might be mistaken for an attempt at seduction, but I paid attention to the way fabrics clung to my body. I wore softer fabrics, smoother textures, colors that made my skin look warmer. I told myself it was coincidence when she complimented my posture more often. When she murmured, "better," under her breath and moved on, I would carry that word like a stone in my pocket all day. Her approval became my measure of success. I caught myself changing the way I moved, slower, more deliberate. My voice dropped a register during the sessions, quieter, less shrill. I used to fill silences with nervous chatter, but now I let them stretch, hoping she'd step into them. I stopped arguing with my dog, stopped apologizing for him. I just listened. To her, to myself, to the strange calm that started to bloom beneath the surface of my daily routine. There was a day when she told me to kneel next to the dog, to correct his stance from a lower position. I did it without thinking. But something in the way she looked down at me, standing tall while I crouched obediently at her feet, sent a flicker of heat through my stomach. It wasn't sexual, not exactly. It was primal, like being in the right place after years of wandering. My hands shook when I stood back up, and she noticed. Her eyes lingered just for a breath before she turned away. I started to find excuses to keep her longer. Questions I already knew the answer to, doubts about techniques she had already explained. Sometimes she stayed, sometimes she didn't. But when she did, I felt lit from within, like a candle catching flame in a dark hallway. She would sit in the chair by the window, legs crossed, gloves resting in her lap. I would make tea, even though she rarely drank it. Just the ritual of serving her something, anything, felt like a tether to a version of myself I hadn't met before. She never used my name. I realized that, one evening, hours after she had left, not once had she said it, and yet I had never felt more known. It was as if naming me would lessen the power she held, or break whatever spell was forming between us. I began to crave that anonymity, to disappear into obedience, into structure, into the quiet place where I didn't have to decide who to be. She decided, and I followed. There was something soothing in it, a stillness I hadn't known I was missing. I had spent so many years carrying the weight of decisions, of independence, of being strong. With her, I could be small, not weak, not broken, just soft, trainable. And I started to wonder if she saw that too, if that was what she had been teaching me all along, not how to control my dog, but how to let go. It changed during a lesson I can't clearly remember, not because it wasn't significant, but because it bled into every other moment before and after. The shift was so seamless, so natural, that by the time I realized we were no longer just engaging in training exercises, it had already become the new normal. She corrected me with the slightest tilt of her chin. A glance downward meant I was holding the leash too high. A lifted brow signaled my stance was off. There were no more verbal cues, no instructions. Her body spoke, and mine responded instinctively. I stopped waiting for words. I didn't need them. Her gaze was enough to pull me into alignment, her posture enough to dictate how I should move or stand or breathe. I began to anticipate her signals before they even formed. I watched her face like scripture, memorizing every subtle flicker of expression, every breath that suggested shift or stillness. It was a silent contract, and somehow it was more intimate than any conversation I had ever had. I no longer wanted clarity. I wanted her gaze, her unspoken approval. There was a day she reached out to adjust my wrist. Her fingers didn't linger, but the pressure remained on my skin long after she let go. I found myself trembling when she stepped behind me to fix the line of my shoulders. She didn't press, just hovered close enough for the heat of her body to fold into mine. My breath caught without warning. I swallowed it down and hoped she didn't notice. But something in the way she paused told me she had. My world started to orbit around these gestures. The training sessions became rituals. The leash wasn't for the dog anymore. It was for me. When she handed it to me, I gripped it with reverence, like an offering. When she took it back, I let go without resistance. My arms relaxed automatically when she neared. My head tilted downward without thought when she stood beside me. My spine straightened the moment I heard her footsteps on the porch. My body was no longer mine. It had learned her language, and it obeyed. Outside of her presence, I became restless. I would replay her movements in my mind, rehearse how I might hold myself differently next time, how I might please her more quickly, more precisely. I wanted her attention like hunger. When she moved, I followed with my eyes. When she stood still, I stilled with her. There was no command given, yet I followed as if leashed. I had never been touched less, yet I had never felt more controlled. It wasn't domination, it was calibration, my body fine-tuned to hers. I began to test the limits of her silence. I would make subtle mistakes, small deviations from her instructions, just to see if she would correct me physically. A misplaced step, an intentional fumble with the leash. And each time she did, her hands would return to my hips or the crook of my elbow, guiding me back with no judgment. Her skin was warm, always warm, even through her gloves. Her scent was faint but constant. Leather, citrus, something else I couldn't name but began to crave like a drug. She once circled me slowly while I stood holding the dog in heel position. No words, just steps. Measured, deliberate, assessing. Her fingers grazed the back of my neck as she passed behind, and I nearly closed my eyes from the shock of contact. It wasn't erotic in the way I used to understand the word. It was deeper, more structural, like my spine had been missing something until she touched it. That evening, I stood in front of my mirror and traced that same spot on my own neck, wondering if she knew what she was doing to me. At some point, I stopped referring to her as my trainer in my own head. She became something else. Not quite a lover, not yet a master. More like an axis, the point around which everything else in me rotated. She never asked questions, never pried, but I began offering pieces of myself anyway, through compliance, through stillness, through the way I dropped my gaze when she looked too long. Submission became my confession. I didn't understand how deep it had gone until one session when she stood behind me in silence for almost a minute. I didn't move, I didn't ask, I just waited. I felt her breath on my shoulder, and I knew that if she told me to kneel in that moment, I would. Not out of lust, not even obedience, but need. Pure, burning need to belong to something, to someone, to her. I wanted to be claimed in whatever language she chose, and for now, it was silence. Even my dog seemed to understand. He mirrored my calm, my attentiveness. He sat when I exhaled, laid down when I dropped to my knees. It was as if the hierarchy in our house had shifted, not by force, but by gravity. She was the center now, of us, of me. My living room became her domain. The couch, the floor, the leash hooks by the door, all rearranged themselves to accommodate her presence, and I did too. The first time she touched my face, it wasn't affectionate, it was corrective. My head had tilted too far forward during a stance. She placed 2 fingers under my chin and lifted. Her thumb rested against my cheek just long enough to quiet every muscle in my body. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. The command was silent but absolute. And when she let go, my skin missed her like absence could be a bruise. I stopped looking in the mirror for approval. Hers was the only reflection I needed. I measured my days not by hours, but by how long until her next arrival. Her body was my script, her silence my rhythm. The words had become obsolete. My body understood what I hadn't yet said aloud. I was being trained, not broken, refined, and I was falling into it willingly, without resistance, like it had been waiting for her touch all along. It was late when she stayed past the usual time. The room had shifted from afternoon brightness to a soft amber dusk, the kind that stretches shadows across the floor and makes everything feel quieter than it really is. We had finished the session an hour ago, but neither of us moved toward the door. She sat in the chair by the window, legs crossed, her gloves resting on her lap. I sat on the rug where we'd just worked with the dog, hands folded neatly in my lap, spine straight, body still. The silence between us felt intentional, not awkward, but dense, like it was meant to test how much space could exist between 2 people before something tipped. She watched me for a long time, not like one looks at someone they're curious about, but like someone studying a subject they already understand. Her gaze held no question, only patience. I kept my eyes low, hands calm, pulse unsteady. The dog had already fallen asleep in the corner, as if sensing he was no longer the one being trained. I felt heat in my cheeks, a kind of quiet tension rising in my chest, as though my body knew something before my mind could catch up. Every inch of me was aware of her presence, her posture, the way her fingers tapped idly on her knee. When she stood, I felt it before I saw it. Her shadow moved over me slowly, casting a shape I didn't dare lift my head to meet. I stayed where I was, sitting still, breathing through my nose, eyes cast downward. Her footsteps moved around me, once, twice, like she was drawing a circle with her silence. Then they stopped behind me. I could hear the soft creak of her knees as she knelt, and the warmth of her body approached from behind. She didn't touch me, not yet, but I could feel her energy, a steady hum at the edge of my skin, and I leaned into it unconsciously. Her fingers touched the back of my neck, light at first, like a question unspoken. She traced a line down to the base of my spine, slow and deliberate. I didn't flinch. I let her. Her other hand slid over my shoulder and down my arm, wrapping around my wrist with a grip that was firm but not forceful. I felt myself exhale without meaning to, my body surrendering, not out of fear, but need. There was no permission asked and none needed. I was already hers, even if we had never said it. She guided me to my knees without a word, just a gentle tug and a shift of her weight behind me. I followed easily. My forehead lowered, my hands resting against my thighs. I waited, unsure of what would happen, but certain it had already begun. Her breath was close to my ear, slow and even, and I felt her hand press against my lower back, anchoring me. I thought she might stop there, might pull away and leave the moment suspended like all the others, but she didn't. Her hands moved again, sliding up my sides and then forward, across my abdomen, pulling me upright until my back pressed against her chest. I was enveloped by her, warm, solid, steady. Her arms wrapped around me, not possessive, but grounding. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against her shoulder, unsure when the shaking in my hands had started. She held me like that for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than minutes. Her fingers moved in slow circles over my stomach, soothing and firm. I had never felt so still in someone else's arms. Eventually, she moved, shifting us both so we faced each other on the floor. Her hands were on my waist now, thumbs pressing gently into my ribs as she looked at me with something unreadable. I held her gaze this time. I didn't look away. Something in me had shifted. Some thread of fear or shame had snapped, and now all that remained was longing, pure and heavy and full. I reached for her, slow and uncertain, but she caught my wrist mid-air and held it, not to stop me, but to show me that I already belonged. Her lips touched mine so softly at first I wasn't sure it had happened. A brush, a pause, and then a second pass, deeper, firmer, filled with intent. I opened to her, every part of me melting into the heat of that kiss, the pressure of her hands, the taste of her breath. She kissed like she spoke, measured, deliberate, and without apology. I let her take control. I didn't want to lead. I only wanted to follow, to surrender fully to the thing I had been resisting for weeks, months, maybe even years without realizing it. She pushed me gently back onto the rug, her body following mine, slow and certain. Her hands moved over me like she was reading something written into my skin, something secret only she could decipher. I arched into her, breath hitching as her mouth found the hollow of my throat, the curve of my collarbone, the edge of my jaw. Each kiss was a command I was desperate to obey. I ran my hands up her back, feeling the taut muscles beneath her shirt, the tension in her body mirroring my own. I ran my hands up her back, feeling the taut muscles beneath her shirt, the tension in her body mirroring my own. Clothes loosened and shifted, piece by piece. My blouse lifted, her shirt tugged free, our hips aligning with an ease that felt inevitable. She didn't rush. She moved with the kind of precision that suggested she'd imagined this moment more than once, studied it, prepared for it. Her hands dipped beneath my waistband, her fingertips grazing bare skin, and I gasped softly, legs parting without instruction. My breath quickened as her mouth returned to mine, and I pulled her closer, anchoring myself to her weight. When she finally touched me, really touched me, I felt something inside me unravel. Her fingers were slow, confident, devastating. She moved with purpose, no hesitation, no doubt. I clutched at her shoulders, my body rising to meet her with every stroke, every motion building heat deep in my belly until it bloomed into something uncontrollable. I came hard, without sound, my mouth open but empty, chest heaving. She didn't stop until I was limp beneath her, trembling, undone. She lay beside me afterward, one arm draped over my stomach, her face buried in the crook of my neck. I turned toward her slowly, still catching my breath, and rested my hand over hers. No words were spoken, none were needed. The silence we had always shared was still there, only now it had changed. It wasn't about control anymore. It was about something deeper, possession, trust, contact that left no bruises, only permanence. After that night, something elemental shifted in the way I moved through the world. It wasn't just the memory of her touch or the lingering echo of breath against skin. It was the way I began to carry myself, slower, more deliberate, as though some unspoken rhythm had been etched into my spine. I didn't ask if she would return. I didn't need to. Her presence was no longer a visit. It had become the gravity in my home, and I aligned to it like a tide. I found myself waking earlier, tidying things that were already clean, choosing my outfits with the same intention one reserves for rituals. She began coming at odd hours, sometimes in the morning when the air was still heavy with sleep, other times just before sunset when the windows caught golden light and cast soft shadows along the floor. I never asked for a schedule. I learned to be ready without knowing when. There was no pattern, but there was always precision. Her knock, when it came, never startled me. It felt like a confirmation, like a call to kneel even before the door opened. The leash was never mentioned again. She still brought it, of course, coiled neatly at her side, but it became more of a symbol than a tool. My dog, once restless, now obeyed with the same silent loyalty I was learning to emulate. I could feel his eyes watching me sometimes during sessions, as if he understood the new hierarchy and no longer questioned it. I wasn't the one giving commands anymore. I was following them, willingly, gratefully. I started to crave her touch like air, not just the erotic pulse of skin on skin, but the structure she brought with it, the way her hand on my lower back could silence my mind, the way a single press of her fingers against my wrist could dissolve all noise inside me. I didn't need permission to feel owned. I already was. Each time she corrected my stance or brushed past me to retrieve something from her bag, I felt it again, that invisible thread tightening around my chest, grounding me deeper into something I had no name for. The day I left the collar on the table, I did it without fanfare. It was new, black leather, smooth, wide, unadorned. I hadn't told her I bought it. I hadn't told myself why. but I placed it there carefully, beside the mug I'd set out for her, and stepped back. When she arrived, she didn't acknowledge it immediately. She walked in, unzipped her coat, set her gloves on the counter. Then her eyes moved to the table, and I watched her fingers reach out and touch it. She said nothing, but I felt the shift in the room. Heavier, thicker. I lowered my eyes and waited, standing still like an offering. She stepped toward me, slow, calm, deliberate. I didn't flinch as she lifted the collar and brought it to my neck. The leather was cool, firm, smelled of smoke and oil. When she buckled it, I exhaled, long, slow, trembling. Her hands paused there, just under my jaw, thumbs pressing gently at the hinge. My breath hitched, my body softened. I didn't speak the entire evening. She didn't ask me to. We moved through the house as if dancing. I followed her with quiet footsteps, knelt when she entered the living room, bowed my head when she placed her hand on it. Every gesture was quiet praise. I began to understand the language of silence as something richer than speech. Her grip on my collar became the punctuation I had been waiting for all my life. That night, she didn't take me to bed. Instead, she sat in the armchair, legs crossed, hands folded, and told me to undress with a glance. I did, slowly, carefully. I stood before her wearing nothing but the collar, heart pounding so loudly it filled the entire room. She watched me without expression, her eyes scanning every inch of me, not as if judging, but as if assessing what she already possessed. I lowered myself to my knees, hands resting on my thighs, back straight, and waited. Time passed in silence. Her gaze never faltered. The longer she looked, the more exposed I felt, not because I was naked, but because she saw everything, my hunger, my fear, my obedience. When she finally stood and crossed the room, her fingers traced the edge of the collar before sliding down my cheek. I closed my eyes. Her touch wasn't tender. It was precise, meaningful, a gesture of ownership, not affection, and it made my throat tighten with something close to devotion. I slept on the floor that night, at the foot of her bed, not because she told me to, but because it felt right. The rug was warm from the heat of her presence. I curled up, naked, collared, my body aching in that strange, beautiful way that comes not from pain, but from surrender. She didn't speak a word as she turned off the light. The room went dark, and I closed my eyes with a smile on my lips. For the first time in years, I felt held, not by arms, but by structure, by knowing exactly who I was. The next morning, I woke before her and stayed in place. My neck ached slightly from the collar, and I welcomed it. I didn't want to remove it. I didn't want to return to normal. I no longer cared what normal had ever meant. My reflection in the window showed a woman transformed, still, kneeling, open. I had traded the illusion of control for something deeper, something stronger, something leather-bound and wordless, and I never wanted to take it off. She left without a word. No slow withdrawal, no farewell glance, no explanation folded into a gesture, just silence. One evening, she was there, sitting in my living room with her usual stillness and weight, and the next, she was gone. Her absence wasn't announced. It simply arrived, quiet, brutal, absolute. I waited for her the next day, and the next. Then the week passed, then two. Nothing. No message. No reason. At first, I told myself she would return, that it was a test, that maybe I had misread a cue or failed to hold a posture long enough, and she was giving me time to reflect, to prove my patience. I replayed every moment of our last meeting, trying to find what I had done wrong. I dusted the surfaces she once touched. I re-washed the mug she once drank from. I straightened the rug a dozen times, aligning it to the corner of the table just the way she liked. But she never came back. When I finally opened her drawer, the one she always kept closed, it was empty, clean, as if she had never been there at all. The gloves were gone, the harness, the clicker, even the leather pouch that always smelled faintly of cedar and oil. All of it vanished like a magician's sleight of hand. But on the edge of the table, left behind like an afterthought, was the collar. Mine, the same one she had buckled around my neck. It had been cut through the center, cleanly, a single blade. The leather curled at the edges like scorched paper. I held it in my hands for hours, unsure if I wanted to cry or scream. My chest felt tight, hollow, carved out. I pressed it to my face, inhaled the ghost of her scent, and sat on the floor with my back against the cold wall. I stayed like that until the sun vanished and the room went black. My dog came and lay beside me, resting his head on my leg, quiet and still. Even he knew the ritual had ended. I stopped sleeping in my bed. It felt too large now, too clean, too ordinary. I started curling up on the floor again, on the rug where we had trained, where she had touched me, where I had first learned the language of silence. I wore the cut collar around my wrist like a bandage. At night, I would loop it loosely around my neck, just enough to remember, just enough to pretend. The days became soft and blurred. I forgot to answer calls. I stopped leaving the house. Time passed in strange patterns. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night thinking I heard her knock. I would rush to the door, barefoot, breathless, only to find stillness. The hallway stretched into quiet like a punishment. I would slide down the door and press my forehead to the wood, hoping she was just beyond it, watching, waiting. But there was no one, only the dull echo of want reverberating through my chest like an old injury. My body changed. I lost weight. My appetite dulled. The mirror reflected something feral now, eyes too wide, jaw clenched, skin too pale where her hands once warmed it. I tried to recreate her presence in my mind, standing naked in the center of the room, arms behind my back, head lowered. I whispered her phrases to myself, trying to summon that old sensation of obedience, but my voice lacked the weight hers carried. My commands sounded empty, hollow, childlike. There were days when I considered reaching out, calling every number I had, searching online, showing her photo to strangers at the park. But then I would remember her silence, the way she had always controlled the frame, the pace, the exit. She didn't leave by mistake. She vanished with intention. That knowledge burned deeper than any goodbye. It was a severing, final, clean, like the cut in the collar. I started to understand that she hadn't broken me. She had opened something that now refused to close. The obedience wasn't a role I had played for her. It had become me. She had unearthed the animal inside, the part of me that longed to be still, to be commanded, to be tethered. And now that it was free, it clawed at me from the inside, restless, hungry, desperate for order. Eventually, I stopped resisting. I gave myself over to the rhythm she had left behind. I rose each morning at the hour she used to arrive. I knelt in the same spot on the rug. I ate only when the light passed a certain point on the wall. I whispered "stay" to myself when I felt the urge to scream. I stopped wearing anything but the shirts she liked. I didn't need a master anymore. I had become my own leash. Now I wait. Not for her necessarily, but for something, for a new command, a new presence, a new hand at my throat. I know I'm ready. She built me for it, conditioned me, stripped me of all the layers I once used to protect myself. What remains is something simpler, something purer, an animal, not wild, but trained, perfectly still, perfectly silent, ready to kneel at the sound of a voice that hasn't spoken yet. And when it does, I will not ask questions. I will not hesitate. I will lower my eyes and follow.